And this is a subject very close to my heart and has been for years. You know, when we look at the amount of energy that we consume in Ireland and the amount of waste. But for me, you know, it's a great honour to be asked to talk here, because in this room, there's a lot of people in this room much more competent and qualified to actually deliver this speech here, you know. But for me, it's, you know, I'm very committed to it. I can't be an activist because I'm a commentator, and therefore I have to kind of keep an impartial, you know, if you like, independent role. I can't be out there campaigning. But when I see this campaign, I see how badly needed it is. It's urgent that we address this issue, you know. When you think that, as according to what Friends of the Earth Dublin have found out, 500 million squandered. I'm not saying all of it is squandered in energy, but it's consumed every year. That's a huge amount of money, and a massive amount of CO2 being generated by that fuel, and probably 95% of that, because 90% of our energy is imported. But when you look at the public sector, it's probably as much as 95% of that fuel is imported fuel. So that money drained out of our economy and the jobs that it loses, besides the fact that the money goes, a lot of it, to corrupt regimes abroad, etc., promoting all sorts of problems globally, conflicts, everything. But really, you know, when we look at it and we say, right, this is money that we could do massively save. If you could imagine the 100 million that could easily be the low-lying fruit, the wastage, without any real big investment required. 100 million of that could be very, very easily saved every year. That's within every public building right across the country, whether it's schools, hospitals, offices, you know, Garda stations, whatever. All of them could make those savings without any difficulty. And we need that money badly now, because that sort of money can go into social issues that are so critically important to us. And when you think that it's really a matter of a policy that will actually take this issue on board from government level, and that it has to be coming from, in my view, a cabinet level, basically, because it's not even something that should be left to individual departments without it being kind of managed at cabinet level. The Taoiseach should be managing this. This is our money, you know. It's our taxpayers' money that's being wasted, going up in emissions every year. And that 100 million could easily be achieved by now and next year. But when I look at the figures, this is something I want to do in my EcoEye over the years, it's very difficult to get figures from government sources. Here we are, taxpayers, and there's a lack of transparency when it comes to knowing these figures. If you take across the public sector, we've got the public sector itself, the state departments. We've then got all of the services that they deliver in the health service, education, you know, social protection, you know, all the various departments. But then we've got the semi-state sector, which is not accounted for either. And we've all of our local authorities. And when you think the energy use in producing water, wastewater, the huge amount of energy that goes into this, it's a massive area of local authorities expend, as the report very clearly identifies. And all of these areas, you know, you just go anywhere and you see massive waste. And yet when you go to some, if you like, exemplary buildings where they are doing great things, and there are some very good examples. I mean, we were talking about Kilbarrack fire station there earlier on, and what Neil McCabe has done, being able to save 80% of the energy in that fire station. 80%. He's brought his energy demand down to 20% of what it was before he started this voluntary initiative within that fire station, and got all of the rest of the team around him, out in the firefighters out there, to engage in it. But an 80% reduction, that's the sort of level that can be achieved. And if we take the big picture and look to 2050, for example, we know that we're going to have to be 90% reduction in energy in Ireland. And if we take the overview of this and we take transport, 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, because if we take agriculture with its methane and nitrous oxide emissions, that's going to be a harder one to tackle than other sectors, simply because it's a growth area, the demand for food. So I'm leaving agriculture aside for the moment. But we still have to achieve a 90% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions by then, in less than 40 years. To do that, the energy sector is going to have to carry that, which means it's going to have to be at least 100%, which means no use of fossil fuels well before 2050 in all of our uses, in transport, in power generation and in heat. And we look at the scenario at the moment and we look at, say, heat, which is 1/3 of our energy use. Only 1% of our energy in our buildings, 1% is from renewable energy. Besides the squandering of energy and the incredible waste, it's all very carbon-intensive fuels, So we have a huge issue with this. And as I mentioned, it's a massive amount of imports. We're the most reliant country on imports of fossil fuels in Europe. If you leave aside some small islands that we could look at, Ireland is particularly bad compared to the rest of Europe. So all of that money leaves our country that could be generating jobs. Every million of the 6.5 billion that's wasted in energy every year, that's in the national energy, that's in heat, transport and power, could be generating probably 60,000 jobs if all of that money was kept in our economy. So when I look at the public sector who represent us, by the way, is there anyone here from the public sector? No? No, and this is about the public sector. Are there? Okay, but is there anyone here representing the public sector here today in terms of this issue? Is there any politicians here? Yeah? Well, Eamon Ryan, yeah. But are there others here? Because we know how committed Eamon is to this. But if you think this is an issue that concerns every TD, every senator, every minister in the country, and nobody is here, and this is a topic that has never been discussed at cabinet level, yet it is a massive area of money wastage in Ireland and a massive area where our carbon emissions are 1.5 times the European average in Ireland. We emit on average 16 tonnes per person per year of CO2. In average is less than 10 tonnes. And when you think of how far behind we are, the difficulty in meeting these targets ahead are going to be very, very difficult for us. So when I look at, for example, take our schools, and the report goes very clearly into what schools can be doing. We know that, for example, the Green Schools Initiative is a great success in Ireland. It's in probably 2/3 of our schools now, maybe even more, and that's a great initiative. But it hasn't transferred into the actual buildings themselves. In other words, you have good teachers there in schools, you have local authorities backing them up with advice, etc., like, environmental officers. But when it comes down to the big issue, there's nothing going on, typically, So the squandering of the energy and the massive carbon aspect of that energy is not being taken. And schools should be, if you like, the exemplary buildings, where pupils in schools should be seen, if you like, they should be the ones that are going out spreading the message about the new solutions and the good solutions. And we should be using our schools as lighthouses, if you like, to demonstrate the type of solutions that we need badly in this country. And then we look at the amount that goes on in hospitals and in that sector. But then we look at just the waste of energy in our office buildings, the massive waste in air conditioning. Air conditioning, in my view, is really bad design in Ireland. Any building with air conditioning in Ireland is an example of bad design. And that's something I'm speaking as an architect. When I see air conditioning in an Irish climate, it makes absolutely no sense. Sealed buildings with unhealthy air conditions, sick building syndrome type conditions caused by these sealed buildings, and problems of huge energy demand into air conditioning. It is absolutely insane that we're using it. But yet, an awful lot of our public buildings, our modern public buildings, are air-conditioned buildings. And that is something we're going to have to change. We look at the actual energy performance of these buildings, and they're incredibly poor. But it's very difficult to get figures on it. I know that, for example, bigger buildings, state buildings, have to have their building energy rating up in the foyer of the building on display. but it gives very little information, you know, in fact, of what the energy or the breakdown of that energy in terms of lighting, power, use, heating, cooling, all the different areas of energy consumption. It doesn't give those figures. And we should be able to relate these figures right down, and they should be transparent. And to me, it's a very serious indictment on the public sector, is the fact that this information isn't available to all of us as tax citizens and taxpayers in the country, that we should know what the figures are. We should be able to click on a website and see how much energy does that school consume, or that office building, or hospital. How much per, for example, pupil is it consuming, in other words, so that we can compare one school with another. In other words, if there's divided by the number of pupils, and you'll get the amount of emissions or energy consumption per pupil. It should break down based on the amount of heat, the lighting, the power, you know, all of the different ways of use. And that information should be in the public domain. Because if we don't have a baseline and that we can relate to and we can compare like with like, we're not going to go forward with this. But to me, that should be the first thing that I believe the state sector should do, is to identify that. And by the way, there's no big difficulty in it. Any school could do that within 3 hours. They just take their 3 last year bills, each for, say, take the last 3 years, divide down what their heating bill and their power was at least. That's something very simple to do. And that will say it's not just the amount of money they've spent on those fuels, but the amount of kilowatt hours or tons of fuel that they've used, or litres of oil or whatever. It can be very quickly broken down. So if we had those figures, we could at least start to look at and compare one with another. But that information is not available. And I do know there's some very good individuals in places like OPW and SEAI and Department of Communications, Natural Resources. There are individually people doing lots of good work, and I know them. But it's not being, if you like, treated at a serious enough level. There's no joined-up thinking on this. And unless this is taken directly to the Taoiseach should be taking responsibility for this 500 million of our taxpayers' money that is being squandered every year. Now, I'm wrong to say squandered in 500 million, but certainly that 100 million is being squandered, and the rest should be on a target to achieve the 33% target that the state has set for reduction by 2020 in all of our energy consumption in state public buildings. That 33% is a target now that time is running on it. And the way it looks, we're not going to meet that target. And we should at least have a roadmap to 2020 that shows exactly how the state sector is going to meet this commitment, because we're relying on them to meet this. All of our future strategies are based on the state sector. State sector is meant to be leading. The state sector is not leading. And I want to make that clear. The state sector is a laggard coming from behind and doing nothing. And nobody's taking responsibility because the state sector doesn't take responsibility directly themselves for, if you like, the taxpayers' money that is being squandered. Money that is so critically needed to go into different services, etc. So all I can say is this campaign, to me, is something I very strongly support. I really want to see this thing becoming a major issue, and it needs to be addressed at Cabinet level. There should be a special session of Cabinet to deal with this issue and to see how we can save that 500 million and meet our targets and be a leader for others and generate those thousands of jobs that can be generated. I mean, if we take the 500 million of imported fuel, you know, that alone could generate probably 10,000 jobs. In that order, that's the sort of job numbers it could generate. So, I mean, every million would represent about 20 jobs. You can very quickly work out those figures. That would be when you go beyond the first stage, which is the kind of simple ones, which is the low-lying fruit of just behavioural change and managing things and making sure that energy is being kind of, if you like, treated in a more serious level instead of the way it's being squandered. But as you get down through that, into putting in retrofit programs into buildings, into switching from imported oil and gas and because electricity is so carbon intensive, to renewable energy fuels, all of those will require capital and investment. But a lot of that money that could be saved now, that 100 million that we're talking about, could form, part of that could go into a fund to upgrade so many of these buildings that badly need to. Because we need to set that target 2050 and then work back 2020, 2030, 2040. And we should have a clear roadmap on where this is. So I want to see the state sector acting responsibly on this. Up till now, they have failed on this. There's been a lot of talk, and it's very clear that when it comes to any kind of public relations exercise by state sector, they will put a slant on it to sound like they're doing great things. But the reality is that if we look back over the years and look at what they have achieved, it is appalling in the overall context of what they've done. There will always be those good stories, the good solutions of the individual projects, or even OPW have done about 250 buildings upgraded, and that's a great success. I mean, there are lots of good stories out there. But in the overall, it's a very, very poor indictment on our society, the way we've let this thing go. And that money is badly needed now for so many other uses in our country. So best of luck, Anna, and to Victoria, and to Simon, and to all the team here from Friends of the Earth Dublin, and of course to Friends of the Earth generally, and for all of you that have come here today. Thank you.